Welcome to our discussion on the presidency. We are moving forward, and this is a good place for us, particularly this year, because we are in the midst of a presidential election. So, reviewing this material should be a little more front of mind than some other things. So, one place I like to start is how we actually view the presidency. Before we get to what the presidency is supposed to be, kind of nuts and bolts wise, what is it that we expect out of our president? And if you look at popular perceptions of the presidency from the media, from television, movies, etc., we really like a strong president and expect certain qualities of a president that we've come to expect in real life and usually are disappointed in real life. We look to the president as a symbol of the nation. It's the only national office that everybody in the country who is registered to vote can vote for. It's the only one office. It is our representative to the outside world. And so this expectation is that it's going to somehow embody American values. And Barber talks about this being an important part of why the presidency was created. That because of all of these missing ingredients that we have for a good republic, the two things that the founders had to create included Congress, and we talked about that last week, and a presidency, which acts as a national figure and embodies what he calls the character of a nation. It's a symbol in many respects. A symbol that contains our hopes and dreams and everything that's good about us, which is why we get a little carried away with it, because quite frankly, the presidency does not have as much of a role on our day-to-day lives as Congress or, and sometimes even the courts. But the presidency is this national symbol, and he talks about the importance of that for our country. And a lot of times people point to Machiavelli. So some of you may have read Machiavelli in other classes. Machiavelli wrote what is now a book, although it wasn't a book to start with, called The Prince. And it's sort of an advice manual for a prince governing a principality. Many people use it as a leadership guide today. And there are certain things that Machiavelli would tell any U.S. president that carry over from discussing a prince and a principality to our country. One is to earn your own power. Don't be beholden to others. Don't be beholden to a name or to special interests. But earn your own power, which is why we like presidents that kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, so to speak. We want our presidents to be multiple things at multiple times, and he calls this the lion and the fox, and people have dubbed this the Machiavellian mask. It's an impossible task for someone to be virtuous and good and upstanding all of the time, but a leader must appear to be, and in appearing to be, and sometimes a leader must act like a fox and be sly and cunning and maybe even deceitful to get to his goals. At other times, a president needs to be strong and resolute and show force, and that would be the lion. Machiavelli says we should expect our presidents or our leaders to engage in grand projects. And these grand projects are domestic projects that help keep people's attention and leave a lasting impression of the leader's goodness. And so if you notice, every president tries to have this domestic agenda that has at least one, if not two, very strong projects. So for Obama, this was undoubtedly Obamacare. For George W. Bush, this was No Child Left Behind or Medicare Part D prescription coverage, and so on. So each president tries to have their grand project that they are remembered for. Some we do really remember them for, like Dwight Eisenhower and the interstate highway system, and some tend to be a little more failures than successes. And speaking of failures and successes, Machiavelli says that a good strategy is for prudent archers to aim high. So leaders, like archers, must aim high to reach a target because gravity pulls you down, pulls your arrow down before it reaches the target. And so if you aim high, even if you come down a little, you still land on the target. So Machiavelli's advice is actually pretty apt for our presidents, especially in terms of election years. and setting yourself up for some of these things. There are two presidencies. This theory of two presidencies is pretty apt. And this is a theory by a political scientist about how we view the presidency. And Machiavelli had a similar idea about a leader having different powers when it comes to foreign affairs and domestic affairs. And so the two presidencies are the foreign policy presidency and the domestic policy presidency. In the foreign policy presidency, the president commands more authority and has more autonomy, doesn't have to answer to Congress as much or the judicial branch usually at all. But in the domestic policy presidency, the president needs to use influence and recommendation, does not have direct powers of influence to create policies. So as we talk about the duties and responsibilities of the president, keep this idea in mind that there are these two areas where the president has different levels of power. So let's talk about these powers briefly. And as we go through them, I'm going to kind of highlight some things that I want you to know, but make sure you read through this and the chapter a little more carefully to get kind of the full picture. So at a glance, I want you to understand that there are express powers and are implied powers. Express powers, just like with Congress, are powers that are directly written down in the Constitution or somewhere. The budget is not the Constitution, but it is written down. And then the implied powers are the powers that are assumed to be there for the president, but not directly written down anywhere. So when we're talking about domestic policy powers, the first is appointments. And this is the ability to appoint people like judges, federal judges, ambassadors, and members of the cabinet, such as Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, etc., to those positions. The Senate has the right to approval, which is called confirmation, and that confirmation vote varies depending on whether there's a filibuster available for it. But generally speaking, the president appoints and the confirmation process goes through the Senate. The president also has this power over the budget. This is not a constitutional power, but was put into law in 1921 in the Budget and Accounting Act. And the reason why it was put in there is because before this, all the branches of the government used to just submit their budgets piecemeal to Congress, and there was no control over the overall size of the budget and priorities of the budget. So in 1921, there was a movement to consolidate this under the president, who submits a budget to Congress for Congress to approve or disapprove or change, and usually it's disapprove and change, and move forward with. And there are specific time frames that this must be done. The president must submit his or her budget to Congress by the beginning of February of every year. And then the president has the power to veto. Now this could be vetoing something of foreign affairs, but it's usually domestic policy. And this is a limited ability to prevent the enactment of a bill by refusing to sign it. There's different kinds of vetoes. So there's the regular run-of-the-mill veto, I'm refusing to sign this. The Congress can override this veto by going back and voting, and if they get a 2/3 vote, 2/3 of the members of both houses say we really want this bill, then the president's veto has no power. It's called overriding a veto. A pocket veto is one way around this. If Congress enacts a law 10 days before the session adjourns, so they're not going to be there in 10 days, a president may just sit on the bill because the president has 10 days to sign or veto a bill. And this is called a pocket veto. It's essentially vetoing by doing nothing. And Congress cannot reconvene to override it. Then there is this idea of a line item veto. Many governors have line item vetoes over budget items in their states. However, President Clinton tried to get this enacted and actually successfully did. Congress wanted him to have this power, but the Supreme Court said this was an unconstitutional veto. So then moving over to the foreign affairs abilities of the president. The president can engage in treaty making, and treaties are official agreements with other countries that carry the weight of law within this country. Treaties require 2/3 of the Senate to approve the treaty, Most of the time, treaties are too difficult to get through the Senate, so presidents have executive agreements. So the agreement with Iran to limit Iran's nuclear weapons capabilities is an executive agreement, although there is some congressional say in it, but it is generally an executive agreement. Foreign policy and war powers also include this idea of a chief of state. Article 2, Section 3 states that the president shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers, and this language was accepted to mean at the time that this was the chief of state role. And the chief of state is the top diplomat to other countries. And not all countries have the same person hold chief of state powers and head of government domestically powers. So that's why this is important, because the president embodies both of these things. And then commander-in-chief, which is usually the term we hear most often. This is the power to direct and control the use of the military. This was previously a pretty limited power, but after the Civil War it has grown. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution and overrode a veto from President Nixon at the time. And this requires that a president formally notify Congress anytime troops are sent into harm's way. And within 60 days, Congress has to approve of the use of troops in harm's way for that to continue. Otherwise, the troops have to be brought home. This retains the need for a president to be able to act quickly. The whole idea of having a president is to have someone who can act quickly when Congress is not in session or can't quickly do things themselves. But it also gives Congress back its authority to declare war. So those are the express powers. But the implied powers are just as important and sometimes more important than the express powers. And they're not written down anywhere. But they are very integral to the job. So the power of recommendation is the first one. And this is the power to suggest legislative or policy solutions to certain problems. And remember, this is important because a member of Congress must be the one to introduce legislation. The president cannot. So the president has to be able to recommend a certain policy solution. And people debate whether this is a good thing or not. It does give the power to the president to set the tone of the debate and the political agenda. And if everybody is voting only on one national office, maybe it's good that that person has some say in recommending policy solutions. But Congress can ignore what the president requests, and the president can lose political capital if he or she pushes too hard for something and it doesn't happen. Furthermore, is this really the role of the presidency? That is a question that many people could debate on forever. And when you couple that with this power of persuasion, it becomes even more of an issue. The power of persuasion is the ability to talk directly to the people and to persuade Congress to act by involving the general public. This is what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit, that the president kind of acts like a preacher in church speaking to the congregation to get something done. And this is done through speeches to joint sessions of Congress, direct messaging to the people, and more recently, social media and TV. And so on the right, you see a list of kind of first president to do these things. And the trend has been to expand the power of the presidency. Between the power of recommendation and the powers of persuasion, the trend has been that presidents are more and more powerful as time goes on. But whether this is a good thing or not, it really is up for debate. And this term, the Supreme Court is looking at a case involving President Obama's use of some implied and express powers to implement changes to immigration reform, and we'll see how they come down on that issue. So before we leave the presidency entirely, one thing we have to talk about is the politics of the presidency. And the politics of the presidency, in addition to the tasks we just laid out, involve these different constituencies. The president has a national constituency. Unlike members of Congress, this is not one state or one district. This is the entire nation. And that means that the president has to be more things to more people. In addition, the president is a member of a political party. And so the party that nominates this president as a candidate is somewhat involved in the president's ability to make policy changes. And then finally, that party's members of Congress are very integral to the president being able to do anything. Without the support of congressional Democrats, President Obama would not be able to get anything done because the president cannot directly submit and vote on legislation. And therefore, the president is best off when he or she has a majority in both houses of Congress, but also when those constituents in Congress that are in the president's party believe in the president's agenda. And then finally, if the president does something wrong, something we believe to be a violation of the trust of the presidency, there is a formal policy for impeachment. That formal policy goes as such. The House of Representatives, namely the Judicial Committee in the House of Representatives, introduces and votes on articles of impeachment. If they get articles of impeachment to pass the House of Representatives, the Senate is required to hold a trial about the articles of impeachment. So if you think about your kind of law and order setup, the House of Representatives acts as sort of a prosecutor getting an indictment. The Senate acts as the judge and jury to try that indictment. And actually, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over the trial in the Senate. And in order to remove a president from office or somehow discipline or punish the president, 2/3 of the Senate must vote to do this. So you need a 2/3 vote. We have never convicted a president in the impeachment process. Never has a president been removed from office. Usually, though, the threat is much stronger than actual impeachment. Our last impeachment trial was in the 1990s with President Clinton. He did not find this to be as threatening as other presidents have because he had strong public opinion behind him at the time. However, Nixon did not. And so Nixon resigned after the Watergate scandal once the articles of impeachment were drafted and approved because he did not want to be the first president to be removed from office, and that was likely going to be the case. So you can see that the impeachment process is pretty arduous, and it's usually the threat of it. But the impeachment process is not just for presidents. Actually, we've had 19 impeachment trials in our history, only 8 convictions. 14 of those impeachment trials were for judges. 1 was for a Supreme Court justice, 1 a senator, 1 a Secretary of War, and 2 for presidents. An impeachment-worthy offense is one that is higher than kind of your average thing. So for Clinton, it was lying under oath. For Nixon, it would have been the misuse of the presidential powers for partisan gain. So that brings us to the end of our discussion on the presidency. Remember, this lecture just covered the highlights, so go back and look at the slides and the material, and we will talk later.